Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Becky. I'm the Programming and Collection Development Librarian here at Storrs Library. I'm very excited to offer this program this afternoon, Reconstructing History and Genealogy, Mom's World War II Letters. This program is sponsored in part by a grant, actually it's fully supported by a grant from the Longmeadow Cultural Council, which is a local agency that is supported by the Mass Cultural Council state agency. And this is co-hosted by Storrs Library and the Longmeadow Adult Center. So thank you to the Adult Center, and thank you to our speaker, Corinne Smith. Corinne is originally from Lancaster County, Pennsylvania. She has served on a Genealogical Society board. She has been a library. She is an author and currently lives in Gardner, Mass. She's here today to tell us about her journey after finding her mother's stash of more than 80 letters from servicemen that she corresponded with at the end of World War II, and her journey of her family history, her genealogy, and what she's doing with those letters now. So welcome, Corinne. Thank you for joining us, and I'm excited to hear about your story.
Great. Thank you very much, Becky. Thank you, everybody who is joining us today from Longmeadow and from wherever. I want to show you, I'm going to have my slides here in a second. Let's see if I can do that now. That would probably be cool. I want to echo Becky's credit that this program is being funded by the Longmeadow Cultural Council, and it's a joint Cultural Council program with Lindsay and the Senior Center and with Becky and Richard Salter Storrs Library. So I'm hoping, let's do this. Let's get this. So the program is, there's that. Okay. So there's my beginning slide, Reconstructing History and Genealogy, Mom's World War II Letters. Now, growing up in Lancaster, Pennsylvania, I was an only child, and there's my mother. She was a nurse, and you'll hear all about that. And actually, let me go back to the way this is. I don't know if I can do it that way. No, let's do it this way. Sorry, thinking about which way I want to do it here. Okay, so when I was growing up, I know my mother kept telling me stories about how every once in a while she would say, oh, we wrote letters to soldiers during the war. That's what we did. Everybody did it. And we wrote to any of the guys that we knew. Well, I didn't know that we had these letters is the thing. And so I was getting ready to, I've lived in Pennsylvania and Illinois and Massachusetts during my adult life, had a number of library jobs. Back in the early 2000s, I was living in Central Mass, and I really liked Massachusetts a lot, but I was called back to take care of my father. My mother was already gone, and I was called back to Pennsylvania to take care of my father. So I did that for his last 2.5 years, and that was the right thing to do. And it was beneficial for both of us. But when I was getting ready in 2017 to move back here to Massachusetts, then I had all of our stuff, his stuff and my stuff. I'm an only child. My parents are both gone. I was married and divorced, don't have any kids. I did our genealogy back in the early 1990s before there was an internet. And basically, I am the keeper of the stuff. And when the keeper of the stuff moves around a lot, wow, it really, really makes you think of what you're going to take with you. And, you know, the rest of the family is going to, you know, the extended family is going to rely on you keeping all your research intact. So anyway, I was getting ready to move back to Massachusetts, and I came upon this box in the basement. I have been traveling with this box since 1994, since my father sold our house in 1994. And it had the name Stamps on the top. It was my father's stamp collection, I thought, and I certainly didn't want to leave it behind. But as I moved the box to get it out of the way of something else, some of these letters fell out of it. And I realized that there was more in this box than just my father's old stamp collection. We used to, whenever we got interesting letters that had stamps on them, we used to cut off the stamps or soak off the stamps and then throw the envelope away. Well, I'm glad we didn't throw these envelopes away, because that first night I sorted all of these and I realized that I had 170 letters dated from the 40s. Now, 54 of these letters were from my mother. Her name was Jeanette. To her mother and sister, because she was in her first year of nursing school. But 86 of these letters were from 16 different servicemen. Only one of them I knew, and that was my Uncle Bud. And my mother was from Allentown, Pennsylvania originally. So when I was sorting these letters, I realized just a little bit from reading what the guys wrote that 7 of them were from her hometown of Allentown, Pennsylvania. 4 of them were from Trenton, New Jersey, which is where her college roommate was from. 4 were 4 brothers from Pittsburgh, the Pittsburgh area. They were all cousins of hers. 1, I'm not sure she knew them at all. And in any capacity, she got his address from somebody. But as I was sorting these letters, I only had their answers to her, not what she wrote to them, but the librarian in me and the researcher and genealogist in me thought, these aren't really my letters to keep. These are somebody else's letters. And if somebody had letters from one of my ancestors, I would want to know. And I'd wished somebody would track me down if they had them. And so that's what I decided to do, try to track down the families of these soldiers. I kind of assumed the soldiers would be gone. They'd be in their 90s. They don't have to be gone, but I kind of assumed they would be gone. And so that's what I started to do that very first night, is try to track down some of these servicemen's families, the survivors of them. And so out of the 16 servicemen, just in the last 2.5 years, I have given letters back to 12 families. And so you're going to hear the stories of the first 5, and you're going to meet these people and how I met these people and how they're related to the guys that Mom wrote to during World War II. So you're going to learn about a lot about my mom's family and my father and I. So there we are in the early 1970s. I was probably wearing bell bottoms because that's what you did. Like I said, I was an only child, so it was just the 3 of us. So my father, Louis Hosfeld, my mother, Jeanette Banzhoff Hosfeld, and me in Lancaster, Pennsylvania. Most of our ancestry is Pennsylvania German, Pennsylvania Dutch, although my mother does have a Welsh line that were miners in Eastern Pennsylvania and also in Wales, where they came from, which is what I found out when I did our genealogy in the late 80s and early 90s. So my mother was from Allentown, Pennsylvania. Here is her extended family. She is the baby in this picture. Her brother John is holding her. And on either side of John are their parents, Anna and Charles. Behind John stands their sister, Bertha, but everybody called her Bill, who knew her. Next to her, making a face, is my Uncle Bud, Charlie, or people called him Bud. And then sitting very staid in a white outfit with a white hat was an aunt, and her son standing behind, my mother's family's cousin. And on the elderly people on the other side of them are my mother's grandparents and my grandfather's parents. So that's the extended family of the Banzhoffs. I have no idea where they were. They were visiting somewhere. Looks official, looks like a capitol or a museum or something. But of course, there's nothing written on the back of this picture to say who's in it or where they are. I recognize the people, but that's what people do. They didn't write on the back who these people were and where they were. But anyway, My mom's a baby in that picture, so it was taken around 1927. The tragedy of her family is that her father, Charles, died in 1931 of thyroid cancer. That means my grandmother, Anna, had the 4 children all on her own. Now, the 2 older ones were getting, older and more responsible, but my mother was only 5 years old. So I don't know how they survived, really. I don't know how my grandmother took care of everything. When I was doing genealogy in the 1990s, I did sit my aunt down and my mother down, and I interviewed them, and I said, tell me what it was like growing up. And they said, well, we were poor, but everybody was poor. So it was all the same for everybody. There was nothing different. But they didn't really elaborate on that. So yeah, I don't know how that happened, but they all turned out with great senses of humor and wonderful people. So here's my mother and her 3 siblings, oldest from left to right. So Bertha or Bill, and then Charles or Bud. He's making a face. Now, there was a really good picture of him in his army uniform on my aunt's mantle forever, but that picture's been lost. So just pretend that he's in an army uniform and older and not making a face. They all had great senses of humor. And then John in his army uniform, and then my mother, Jeanette, on the end there. And then, of course, like I said, my grandmother, Anna, their mother. This is a picture taken out of time because she's actually holding me. So this is dated probably in 1958 or 59. And then key to the family is Teddy the dog. Teddy the dog will have a role to play in this story as well. And I'm very grateful that in my mother's albums, I could find 2 pictures of Teddy the dog. They lived in Allentown, Pennsylvania, which is on the sort of in the middle of the screen there, with New Jersey on the eastern side, Philadelphia down below. It was only about an hour and a half away from Philadelphia. West of Philadelphia is Lancaster, where I grew up. My parents met in Philadelphia, and my father immediately got a job in Lancaster, so that's why I grew up there. So that's southeastern Pennsylvania, in case you need a geography jogger. Allentown's skyscraper looks like this right now, and a lot of those buildings weren't there when the Banzhoffs were growing up, except for the one on the left that stands up above everybody else, and that's the PP&L building, Pennsylvania Power and Light. It's the national grid equivalent for that part of Pennsylvania. It's the electric company, and it was a major employer at the time. And you can see that building all the way around the Lehigh Valley, and it lights up at night with different lights like the Empire State Building does. And so that's Allentown from a distance. Allentown right up close has a lot of brick row houses. A lot of cities and towns in southeastern Pennsylvania are very bricky, I say. And so the Banzhoffs lived at 35 North Madison Street, which is the left-hand one of that little duplex that's sort of in the middle of the screen. And as you can see on the left, I have a wonderful picture of Jeanette and Teddy and Bill sitting on that exact stoop. So I knew when I went back in 2017 that that was the exact house that they lived in. Again, they were living with their mother. My aunt never married, and she lived with my grandmother all of her life, took care of her. So she was the quintessential maiden aunt. And they lived in this house and then moved around the block to another house eventually. But this is where they all grew up. To get to school, they had to walk 8 very long blocks to Allentown High School. Allentown at the time had 100,000 people. It was mainly people of German and Italian ancestry. Now it has 20,000 more and is as diverse as any major city can be. And now it has 2 high schools that serve the city, but this one at the time served everybody, and it still serves a major portion of the city. And then at least once or twice a week, they walked in the other direction to the main street of Allentown, to West Hamilton Street, to go to Christ Lutheran Church. My mother's family was very devoted to this church. There were a lot of Lutheran churches in Allentown, but this was the biggest and possibly the oldest as far as I know. And it's still still there and still operating and still large. Population for congregation, I'm not sure, but yeah. So that's Allentown. Now, when I was getting these letters all sorted out, some of them, as you can see on the left, were airmail letters, just regular on the skinny kind of paper. You remember that? The skinny kind of paper. But some of these were V-mail, and I'm holding them up in front on this picture. And you can see, based on my hand, how small they are. What happened was a lot of people were writing letters to the guys that they knew who were serving in the Pacific or over in Europe or in Africa. A lot of letters were being sent everywhere. And so evidently the War and Navy departments, in order to get a handle on this, decided to microfilm the letters as much as they could. So what they would do is they would give the soldier an 8.5 by 11 sheet of paper, a regular size, and it would already have a heading on there with the address blanks and everything. And then he could either write it or type it, whatever he had access to. And then they would microfilm it. And then I'm assuming they destroyed the original letter. And then when it got sent back to the United States, somebody in Washington would print the letter, but they would print it on these teeny tiny pieces of paper in this teeny tiny envelope that's like 3 inches by 4 inches, if any. Now, if you take one of those and you bump it up to 200% on a regular copying machine, it comes out 8.5 by 11. That's how you can read it now. But back then, yeah, I don't know. I guess I know now why a lot of my relatives had had magnifying glasses on their side tables because of things like this. But another thing that happened with the mail, of course, was not only could they microfilm it, but of course, somebody would read it and would censor it if they had to. And I have one of those V-mails where the bottom 2 lines of my uncle's message are blotted out with black ink. He said something he was not supposed to say. He said something about what they were doing or where they were. He was stationed in Hawaii, but yeah, you weren't veterans in my giving this program to other places. I've met veterans who have said, yeah, well, we kind of got around that because we had a secret code, or we said things in a certain way so that our families would know. One gentleman that I met last month even said, we were heading to France, but I couldn't tell my family that we were heading to France. So what I said was, I feel as though I'm traveling in my grandfather's footsteps, because his grandfather had immigrated from France to the United States long before. And so that was his clue to his family that he was going to France without saying it and without the censoring it out. So I've heard stories like that. It's pretty cool. Back to my mom again. This is her in her high school yearbook from the class of 44. The war was already going on. And so she was already preparing for what she wanted to do with it. Now, you know, in a high school yearbook, they often put a quote or a phrase to describe the person. And for my mother, it was, a babbling brook is never still. That described my mother. She was effervescent. She was an extrovert. My father and I were not. And in our household, she reigned, and she was the loudest, and that's just who she was. Now, here in her high school yearbook, it says that she was in the a cappella choir. It says, although one of her favorite sports is football, she is fond of all sports. She actually taught me football, watching it on TV. I mean, she had 2 older brothers, and they lived in Allentown, which had Muhlenberg College. So she knew football. I'm sure she went to all the high school football games. Anyway, it says here, to be a good nurse is what Jeanette wants, and she will be good medicine to all her patients. After her training period, she would like to enlist as a Navy nurse. Good luck, Jeanette. So those are the plans that she had when she was a senior for the class of 44. Now, she was in a patriotic family form. Everybody was doing something for the war effort. Now, my Aunt Bert, I called her, but like I said, her friends called her Bill. She, of course, was older, so she already had a job. She was secretary for the local highway department, which eventually became the Pennsylvania Department of Transportation. Then, like I said, too, she was taking care of my grandmother, her mother. But in the war effort, she was a neighborhood air raid warden. And so she got to go around wearing a white helmet and whistling a whistle and making sure that whenever Allentown had a practice run, that when, the Germans were going to bomb Allentown at one point, you never knew. Whenever they had a practice run, she would run around and make sure everybody had their lights off or their shades drawn. And if you didn't, you had to get whistled at. She also said, when I interviewed her and my mother for the genealogy, she also said they had to keep a bucket of sand by the front door just in case a fire broke out. So I guess that was, I don't know. She said, I don't know what one bucket of sand was going to do. But I guess if everybody on the block had a bucket of sand, that would do something. So I've also met some people who remembered having a bucket of sand by the front door in case of a fire during the war. My uncle Bud, pretend he's in his Army uniform. Again, he was in Hawaii. He had a desk job as a clerk of some kind. The V-mail that I have him was all typed, so he had access to a typewriter. So he was in Hawaii. Uncle John, standing there in his uniform, was stationed in the Army was stationed in Philadelphia, and he had a childhood accident in which he lost an eye. So he had a glass eye. And so he was only allowed to be stateside and not go overseas. So he was in the Army in Philadelphia. He had a car. He drove my mother and himself home for church many weekends from Philadelphia. And my mother, I'll tell you how she ended up in Philadelphia in a second here. My grandmother, Anna, taking in laundry and doing tailoring, I'm sure, but also knitting. Everybody knitted, they said. They got free yarn from the Red Cross, and they knitted mittens and scarves and what they called helmets, which would sit under the metal helmet that the soldiers would wear. And then there was Teddy the dog. Teddy also had a role in the war effort. The family had made Teddy a hat that had stars on it. And the family story goes that they put more stars on it. They always put one more star on Teddy's hat than Eisenhower had. So whenever General Eisenhower earned another star, so did Teddy, and Teddy always outranked General Eisenhower. And they always said that when the boys come home from the war, Teddy would wear the hat and he would salute them and they would salute him back. And that's a cool story. I wish we had been able to figure out and save Teddy's hat. So Jeanette, what's she going to do in this patriotic family? She decided to join the United States Cadet Nurse Corps. And so what happened with this is a government program that operated at that time. The country desperately needed nurses. It needed well-trained nurses. How were they going to get them, especially, in the years after the Depression and not too many people had money, and how were they going to get a college education, basically? So what the government did was it funded the schools that trained the women to be nurses so the women could go for free. This was an amazing program. It's the only way Jeanette could have gone. Nobody in her family went to college. They couldn't afford it, And so suddenly here's this program where she can go for 3 years and get a registered nurse degree for free. I think they had to pay for the gloves for the uniform, and maybe for the hat, for the cap. Every hospital had a unique nurse's cap at the time. And so she decided to go to Philadelphia to the University of Pennsylvania. Penn had a very good school of nursing, school of medicine at the time, still does, and was well thought of. As a matter of fact, one of the surgeons on the staff at the time was C. Everett Koop. You might remember C. Everett Koop. He used to be on our TVs a lot in the 60s and 70s, warning of the dangers of tobacco and cigarette smoking, and putting the Surgeon General's warning on the packs, on the sides of the cigarette packs. Of course, that didn't stop my mother and her brothers from smoking, but okay. So here's Jeanette in her college yearbook, and the phrase that they used to describe her is "not a moment without some activity." So yes, she was a chatty gal, she was a busy gal. The components of the United States Cadet Nurse Corps program were that once you got this free education, you were sort of required to put in at least a year at a hospital somewhere where there would be soldiers, hopefully. Now, the reality of that is that my mother graduated from high school in 1944. She graduated from Penn in 1947. The war was over by the time she graduated. And there was no accountability. A lot of the women met guys and went off to establish households and families and that kind of thing, get married, have kids. But she stayed on at Penn for 8 years and worked in the hospital there. And she had the unique pleasure of actually having a sort of celebrity patient at one point. Actor Jimmy Stewart's father was one of her patients. I don't know what was ailing Mr. Stewart, and he did get over whatever it was that he was ailing, that he was suffering from. But she got to talk to Jimmy Stewart on the phone and tell him how his father was doing. So that was always pretty cool. At Christmas, we would always watch the movie It's a Wonderful Life on TV. And, Jimmy Stewart comes on and my mother would say, wow, there he is. He talks just like he talks on the phone. So yeah, Penn was prestigious, and it was a really great program for my mother to tap into and to become like a good nurse and a member of the Cadet Nurse Corps. But of course, that whole program disappeared soon after the war was over. So let's get to these letters. That first night that I sorted all the letters out, the first person I decided to try to find his family was Roy Schmoyer. I figured my tactic was going to be what you usually do to trace genealogy, and that would be to start at the end of a person's life and work backwards. So a lot of genealogical research starts with obituaries. So that's what I was planning on doing, seeing if I could find newspaper obituaries for these soldiers. Is who's surviving in the family and where do they live? And so that's what's going to be those were going to be my clues. Anyway, look at Roy Schmoyer's letters here. We have 4 of them. 3 were V-mail, those little ones. And then the last one, and they were addressed to my aunt because it says Dear Bill. So he obviously knew my aunt very well to call her that. But the last letter on the right says Dear Little One. That was to my mother. Evidently, people called her Little One because she was the youngest in the family. I didn't know this. I never ever heard anybody call her Little One. So this was a minor revelation for me. Anyway, look at Roy's letter over there. It says, you probably have been in contact with my home and know all the dirt by now. This letter, by the way, is dated the 3rd of August, 1944. Your letters to me since June 28th are still over in France and didn't reach me yet. Well, anyway, I was in that business, but have no fear about any French girls on my string. I was too busy to even look twice at them. There seems to be, I'm interjecting here, there seems to be a trend in a lot of these letters where no matter where the guy was, the people back home would say, well, I guess you're looking at all the girls over there. You know, it would be France or Italy or England or Hawaii or Australia. And all the guys generally would say, no, 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 that's not the way it is. And so that's what Roy said here. I was too busy to even look twice at them. And Roy continues, but that seems like an awful long time ago now after being in the hospital. It surely is strange to be so inactive and have hopes of getting out soon. I am not walking yet, but with treatment and exercise, it should come quickly. As to your bowling, I admit that you are getting better, but you must improve still more. This was another hint because my aunt was an avid bowler. Evidently, Roy was too. So evidently, he knows the family really well. He's asking later on, where's John? He says, congrats to little one on graduation. I guess she is far from a little one now. Give my regards and love to everyone. Love, Roy. Wow. So he knew the family, no doubt about it. But he's talking about being in the hospital and he can't walk yet. So something's happened that he doesn't really reveal. And in the other letters, he's starting to walk, but it's taking some time. And so, as I said, I wanted to try to track down his family and give these letters back because these are nice mementos. So I just went online. I did not go on ancestry.com or any proprietary database that a library has, not Heritage Quest or Family Search or any of those. I just went online, figured Roy Schmoyer and Allentown, that should land me on an obituary if there is one. And I was right, it did. The Allentown Morning Call is the paper for the city, and evidently Roy died in 2010 at the age of 91. And I can tell it's the right one. I mean, Roy Schmoyer is a pretty unique name, a unique enough name. It's obviously from Allentown. He went to William Allen High, which is really Allentown High at the time. Served in the U.S. Army, 115th Infantry, 29th Division of World War II. Was a longtime employee of Western Electric, which is another big company in Allentown. And under survivors, it says his wife, whose name was Gertrude, that's listed above, and his daughter, Dr. Martha Schmoyer Lomonico of Bridgeport, Connecticut. Well, when you're doing research, you know, one thing leads to another. Okay, so I found Roy's obituary from 2010. His wife was still alive. I wondered if she was still alive. So Gertrude Schmoyer, that's who I looked for next. And well, yes, she was gone too. She died in 2016 at the age of 93. But I can tell that this is a couple. You know, all the little tidbits match up, including the survivor now being just the daughter, Dr. Martha Schmoyer Lomonico of Bridgeport, Connecticut. So, okay, 1, 2, 3. Then my next thing is to look for Martha Schmoyer Lomonico of Bridgeport, Connecticut. And so I found her immediately online. I think Schmoyer is a non-theatrical name, and she is a theater professor at Fairfield University in Connecticut. And so, so she took a stage name of Lomonico. She's a professor of visual and performing arts, but really drama and theater. And since she's a college professor, this is her page, and it's got all of her information on it, including her email address. Whoa, her email address. So here, all of a sudden, I've got out of the box of all these letters, I'm starting to find the family, and I found Roy's daughter immediately with an email address. This is just beyond cool. And then I thought, okay, what am I gonna say? Surprise! I have letters from your father that he wrote 70 years ago that nobody knew we had. So it took me a while to figure out what I wanted to say. And she's the only one that I found an email address for out of the chute. So the rest I would write letters to, snail mail letters. But this is what I wrote to her. And I put in the subject line, WWII Letters from Roy Schmoyer, so that she would know that I was not a Nigerian prince offering untold riches. So what I said to her was, and I was still living down in Lancaster at the time, getting ready to move back to Massachusetts. I said, hello from Lancaster County, Pennsylvania. You and I are evidently in the same age range and we have similar roots. I just started looking through an old box of correspondence and I found 4 letters from 1944, 1945 that I believe your father, Roy Schmoyer, wrote either to my mother, Jeanette Banzhoff, or to her sister, Bertha. All were natives of Allentown. Roy was a sergeant in the US Army and was in France at the time, and England. And then I told her in another paragraph all about the Banzhoffs, the 4 children, because he obviously knew them. And then I said, evidently your father was injured and spent time in the hospital. He alludes to this, but is not more specific. At the time of the writing, my mother was living in Philadelphia. She was enrolled in the nursing school at the University of Pennsylvania. She wrote to a fair number of soldiers, it seems, and she kept all of their answers. Yours are the first letters where I've been able to track down a survivor. Would you like me to send you these letters from the past? None of these people are around to give or deny permission anymore, and I don't think there are any secrets revealed that anyone would be embarrassed by. I'd be happy to mail them to you. I only wish I had looked in this box 20 years ago. And then I hit send, and I sent my email off to Martha Schmoyer Lomanico. And that was a full night of sorting out the letters, deciding I'm going to try to find these people's families and doing the first one. And I thought, okay, that's enough. So I went to bed. The next morning when I got up, I thought, what are the odds that Dr. Martha Schmoyer Lomanico read her email overnight? Well, when I looked at my email, I did have something from her email account, but it was an out of office automatic reply. I am out of the office. I am on sabbatical for this whole semester. If you want to reach me, you can try the department, yada, 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 yada. I'm not going to read my email for most of the time, yada, yada, yada. And I thought, I was disappointed, of course, but geez, we waited this long. I'm not going to contact her department. That's not an emergency. You know, if she reads it whenever. But Marty read this message later that day, and she wrote to me later that night. And this is what she wrote. Corinne, I'm on sabbatical this semester and am actively avoiding my university email, but I dip in occasionally and just discovered your remarkable letter sent yesterday, which has brought tears to my eyes. Thanks so much for taking the time to track me down. I would love to hear how you have done so. Well, Marty, it was kind of easy, actually. You can't really hide, you know, when you're a college professor. Anyway, she says in her email, I distinctly remember the name John Banzhoff. That's my uncle. Although I don't know that we ever met. He was one of my father's groomsmen at my parents' wedding in Allentown in 1953. I didn't know of his friendship with your mother or aunt. And here she's quite savvy in saying this next thing. I'm sure that in those days, conventional married men, and my dad certainly was one of them, did not retain friendships with women other than their wives, alas. Well, yeah, of course not. It's one thing to write to these guys when they're a world away, you know, but when they come home, everything changes and everybody has lives and you're not doing the same things. And even if they're friends of the family, yeah, of course, Roy was a better friend with my uncles than with my mother, of course. So then anyway, in Marty's email, she tells me and us what her father could not say in those letters. She says, my father was wounded in the 4th wave of the D-Day invasion and has a Purple Heart. Wow. Wow. But all Roy had said in that letter was, I guess you know all the dirt by now. Well, I was in that business. Wow. Anyway, Marty said she interviewed her father when Stephen Ambrose was requesting fellow historians to procure firsthand accounts of the invasion. She said it was both fascinating and harrowing. It was the only time he'd ever talked to her about it. She said his memory skipped directly from being on the ship to Normandy from England and then back to the hospital in Britain. Having done her homework prior to the oral history, she said she was thankful that she didn't jar what must have been an unspeakable and unimaginable trauma wading through the bloody body-strewn waters of Omaha Beach by the time he arrived. Wow. Well, so of course she wanted the letters, and after a story like that, I thought, you know, maybe we need to honor our parents a little bit more than just me sending the letters in an envelope. So I decided to drive up to Bridgeport and meet Marty, and Marty, being an only child, is the keeper of the stuff for her family. So here's her father's yearbook picture from the yearbook of the class of 37 of Allentown High. At the time, he was intended to be an architectural engineer, but he eventually went into electricity instead. It says he's tops when it comes to dancing, and few dances go by without his presence. That's cool. And so she's got all the stuff. So I asked her, where did they live? Because I guess I'm geographically oriented, and I wanted to place these people in the neighborhood if I could. So she gave me the address, 228 Northwest Street in Allentown, which is actually kind of on the way between the Banzhoffs house and the school. So I could envision Roy coming out that road, meeting my uncles, and them all going off to school together. I could just picture that. And so here's Marty and her partner Carl, and we had a great time catching up in their house in Bridgeport. Like I said, Marty's the keeper of the stuff, so she's got her parents' wedding picture. Beautiful picture. And there's my Uncle John on the right. And as the more that we were talking, the more I realized when my uncles and my mother's whole family would get together and my uncles would talk about their friends, they probably did mention, gee, what's Roy doing now? They probably did talk about Roy Schmoyer and all the rest of their friends. And so I could kind of get that in the background of my mind. Here's another picture of the wedding party with the girls on one side and the boys on the other, and my uncle is the second one in from the right. So yeah, so they were friends, you know. And then Roy was an avid bowler, so here he is tabulating the results from one of his teams. And evidently, professionally, he was a fan of the bow tie, and he looks like a great guy. And I said to Marty and Carl, so these letters say he was wounded. That he was wounded, and he couldn't walk for a while. I said, could he walk? You know, and they said, well, yeah, that he didn't have a limp at all. I mean, they didn't notice anything. They really didn't know. They really didn't know that he had been hurt that badly. Well, so anyway, so we had a great time talking about our parents. There we are with our pictures, her picture of Roy and my picture of Jeanette. And I thought, this is pretty cool. I got to keep on finding these people. It was just such a rewarding experience. And meeting somebody whose father was a D-Day invasion survivor right away. Wow. That's just, wow. So I thought, oh, I got to keep on going here. So the next person I wanted to try to find was Donald Eitner. And I liked his handwriting quite a bit. You know, what are we going to do without handwritten letters? Aren't they cool? Look at his handwriting is really, really interesting. And he also was a little older than my mother, and he was also more a friend of her brothers. You can see that very first letter on the left. I certainly was very pleasantly surprised to receive a letter from you. Gosh, it hardly seems possible that you are out of high school. I always remember you as Bud and John's sweet little sister, and here you are grown up in what seems like overnight. I can picture you as being fairly tall. Am I right, Jeanette? See, you know, she was growing up and he was already gone. So he must have known the family. In fact, he says his next paragraph says, I could ask you a million questions about Allentown High. Are the kids still crazy as ever? How was graduation? Did you go to any basketball, football, or baseball games? Or perhaps get to some of the dances? I sure liked high school and wish I was back there right now. Believe I could even sit through a class in trigonometry. Now, I don't know what exactly my mother wrote to them, other than what they wrote back to her that I could kind of put together through the lines. But I know that what she wrote to her mother and sister was all the stories about nurses training and everything that they were learning in class, and everything that they had to do, and what it was like to live in this big apartment building, and all of these things. And unfortunately, she was into graphic detail and telling stories, so she couldn't tell them the stories in person, so she wrote about them. And one of the stories she told was that in their anatomy class, right off the bat, they had to dissect a cat. Now, she never told me this when I was young, I don't think, because I would have remembered it, and I would have been appalled, because we were and so maybe she just to save me from mentioning it. But it seems as though she talked about it to these guys. Well, they were in the Army, or Don was in the United States Army Air Corps, the precursor to the Air Force. He was stationed in England. And I don't know what he was doing exactly, except that he had personalized stationery. So he had some kind of job of responsibility. And so I guess she figured these guys could handle being told that she was dissecting a cat, because she certainly did tell him in her first letter. And so he mentions it, and he says, wow, you have quite a time back there with the cat. And then he says, I guess Teddy is about 4 or 5 years old now. Remember the time he got struck by a car in front of your house? Much excitement at 35 North Madison Street for a while. Well, she didn't tell me this. Now, I know Teddy eventually became okay, because I know he survived the war. But geez, first of all, Donald Eitner knows the family. He even knows Teddy. But yeah, weird, wild stuff. He even knows where she lives, so he's got to be in the neighborhood. He also says, I do quite a bit of bicycle riding in the evenings around the English countryside, often stop in at a dance at one of the surrounding towns. They are a bit boring, though, and the music is corny, to say the least. Some of the girls are fairly good dancers, but I wouldn't trade one American gal for 100 English. I really mean it. We also have a swell Red Cross Aero Club on the base, which gives a dance every Wednesday night with a very good band made up of American soldiers. So Donald is in England, stationed in England, and he's riding his bicycle on times that he can get away from the base, and dancing and doing all these things. And everybody's talking about everyday stuff. They're not really talking about the war. First of all, the guys can't. They can't say what they're doing. So all they want is, what's happening at home, and this is what I'm doing here that makes life bearable. So I tried to find Donald Eitner the way I found Roy Schmoyer. I figured, I'm going to find an obituary and a son or a daughter. But the more I looked, the more I found an address instead. And I pretty much surmised that Donald Eitner was still alive. I wasn't quite so sure what to do with that information. I had just seen my father through some end-of-life memory issues. Not every senior has memory issues, but you never know. You don't know if, somebody, you don't know what somebody's going through. And I still thought to myself, I'm going to feel more comfortable if I give these letters to a son or a daughter than to him himself. I was a little scared of doing that. But I did find his wife's obituary. Now, it was all the way back in 1984. And it said down at the bottom, surviving with her husband are 2 daughters, Nancy J., wife of Sid Grossman, and Patricia, wife of James Winkelspecht. Good German names in Lehigh County. But 1984, wow. And those are their daughters, and that's who they're married to, and that's where they live. What are the odds that in 2017 they're going to still have those names and still live in those places? Wow, that's what you have to think about when you're dealing with female genealogy and taking on other surnames and all that kind of stuff. Fortunately for me, and they usually put the children's names in the obituary in order of oldest to youngest. So Nancy was older than Patricia. So I wrote to Nancy, and fortunately for me, she still has the name Grossman, even though she was divorced. And so here's Nancy Eitner Grossman. And we got together to meet for lunch and talk about her father. And yes, her father was still alive. And yes, it was probably a good idea that I give her the letters and not him. He was not in a good place, shall we say. And so she wasn't taking care of him. Somebody else was, and wasn't necessarily an ideal situation. And it's not my family, so I wasn't going to get involved in any of that kind of thing. I could definitely understand and relate because I'd just gone through some things with my own father, and so wow. Naturally, I asked, for a picture, if she had a picture of him in uniform, and she said, well, there was a really nice picture of him in uniform, but just because of the circumstances of where he was living and everything, she couldn't get it. And again, I said, fine, that's not a problem. I asked her more details about Donald. So actually, I had access to the Allentown Public Library historical local history room, and they had a lot of old yearbooks there. So I could look Donald up myself in the 1938 yearbook. Nancy and her sister Patty were not the keepers of the stuff at the time, so they didn't have this stuff with them. Evidently, in the high school yearbook, they called Don Peck because they thought he looked like Gregory Peck, maybe? Not sure. Anyway, it says he loves swing music and never fails to attend the annual school dances. Well, isn't that cool? So in school, he liked to dance. And now during the war, he's talking to my mother in letters about how he's going around dancing around the English countryside. In the yearbook, it also says he was good for a basketball game anytime. In his spare time, he's at home building model airplanes or radios. Isn't that interesting? And then he goes into the U.S. Army Air Corps. And now he's in England with bigger planes. Also likes bright colors. Watch those striped socks he wears. Sounds like a great guy. So as I did with the others, I said to Nancy, so where did he grow up? And she said, where did he live? And she said, well, that was a different situation. She said he lived at 31 North Madison Street with his grandmother. Well, that's only 2 doors down from 35. So naturally, the Banzhoffs knew the Eitners. They were only 2 doors away. So she said, well, it was a difficult situation. His parents were out of the picture for some reason. His grandmother was raising him. Well, my mom's mom was raising all of them too. So yeah. Of course they knew each other. Of course, whenever anything happened in front of one house, it would happen in front of the other. Nancy said, my father never talked about his military career. He never thought that it would be, it was relevant to him. He had served in the Air Corps in England, but he never felt like a veteran or anybody that needed to be honored because he wasn't on the front lines. In other words, he wasn't Roy Schmoyer landing at Normandy, as one example. And so he didn't really talk about it. He didn't admit it. He didn't connect with any kind of veteran group. And that kind of made her feel bad, I could tell. And I said, well, but look at these letters. He had some kind of responsible job because he had personalized stationery for the Army. Of course, he was using it to write letters from home to home, but oh well. But he had to have something, some kind of responsibility. So I gave Nancy the letters. Now she and her sister Patty were able to read them to Don on a Father's Day. And there you see Nancy on the right and Patty in the middle, and there's their father, Don. You can see he looks like his high school yearbook. And they're fooling around, having a good time. And so they read him the letters and, kind of politely prodded, do you remember England? Do you remember bicycling around? I think he remembered bicycling and dances, but maybe not exactly what he was doing for the Army. And I think he remembered living on Madison Street and maybe some of the neighbors. I'm not sure if he remembered the Banzhoffs and Teddy. But I was grateful that I could give her the letters so that she could read them and share that kind of information with her father, both of them. And that was pretty cool. At the same time, I knew that he was not in good health and that things were not going well. And so I wasn't too surprised when about 9 months went by and Nancy emailed me and said, well, my father's in hospice right now. We're taking care of him as best as we can. And then soon after that, she wrote to tell me that he had passed away. And almost immediately, as soon as she did that, she also sent me a picture of his military picture that she had told me about before, of him for the Army Air Corps. And it is a nice picture. It does look like him. And she also must have been, since Nancy was the older of the two, she must have also been the person who wrote the obituaries for the morning call, because she deliberately said he was a World War II veteran and served in the European theater of operations. Even if her father didn't say it in real life, she was going to say it. And he was 97 years old, Don was. And if you look at his picture over there, not only does it have a contemporary picture, but you see there's also a toggle that there's another picture hiding behind there. The other picture hiding behind there is his military picture. If he wasn't going to associate with it during his lifetime, Nancy and Patty wanted him to be connected with it somehow, be connected to it somehow, so that for the record, people would know that he served in World War II. And I was just, like I said, I was just happy that I could give the letters back when I did, and they were able to share them in time. Here's letters from Paul Kemmerer, and he was in the Army, and he was on his way to Italy for some of these letters. He was on a ship somewhere. In Paul's letters is the only instance of the censor actually physically cutting out words from the letter. You see in the middle letter there, if you compare it with the one on the left, you can see they cut out the date, physically cut out the date from the paper, and then they physically cut out one word from the second line. And so this letter says, "Dear Jeanette, it is most appropriate that I write to you on this my first blank at sea." Now there's a little tail there that the word they didn't cut out, so maybe the word was duty or day. Whatever it was, whatever his first whatever at sea, they cut it out, because of course they didn't want the enemy, if the enemy got this letter somehow, they didn't want him, the enemy, to know what was happening where and when. That's why they cut the date out too. Anyway, if you keep on reading Paul's letter, it says, "Tonight we have a song service. Naturally, when I hit a bad note, I'll think of you." Evidently, good sense of humor. Evidently, he knows my mother from choir, maybe. All kidding aside, though, thus far, my trip has been perfectly swell. Swell weather, calm waters, and swell food. Really, tonight I had 2 helpings of sirloin steak and ice cream. Not bad a what. No, I haven't gotten seasick and never expect to. A great majority, unfortunately, have been sick, this having been their first experience on the ocean. I spend a lot of time reading, eating candy, and sleeping. Not much news at this time to hand down to you. And then down below, because he knows everybody in the family is going to read this letter, he says, "Hey, John, imagine this. A carton of cigarettes cost only 45 cents. Well, anyway, so Paul is on a ship somewhere. He says he hasn't gotten seasick, but everybody else did. Somebody in one of my other audiences says, "I don't understand this. The census person, the censor, cut out one word up above. But if they were worried about what information the enemy had, shouldn't they have cut out the whole paragraph about everybody being seasick on board and not being able to do their jobs? Wouldn't that have been more important to conceal from the enemy if they're worried about that?" Yeah, probably. But somebody else said, everybody was seasick. Didn't matter. So the letter on the right cracks me up, because up at the top on the date, which is either March 10th or October 3rd, depending on how he wrote it, 1944. It says sunny Italy, but not now. I don't know if that means it's not sunny anymore or it's not Italy now, but that could be one of those cryptic things that the soldiers were concealing and all that kind of thing. Anyway, obviously Paul knew Mom from the neighborhood somehow. So I'm looking up Paul Kemmerer. I thought that would be a unique enough name. I actually sent a letter to somebody I thought was his daughter. She called me on the phone when she got the letter and said, no, you got the wrong Paul Kemmerer. This is not mine, but thank you for doing this. So I had to keep on looking online for, like I said, obituaries. And I found Paul's mother's obituary, Florence. And she died in 1973, so that's a long time ago. She was a member of Christ Lutheran Church. So, hey, they went to the same church. So, okay, that's one reason they knew each other. But in her obituary, it said, surviving are a son, Paul A. of North Brunswick, New Jersey. Whoa, that's why I didn't find him associated with Allentown. So knowing that, I could fudge around a little bit more on the internet and eventually figure out that he and his wife had retired to Florida, where their daughters were. And so I eventually found Joanne Kemmerer Schultheis, who is one of Paul's daughters in Florida. And I didn't want to drive to Florida. Don't fly. Didn't want to drive to Florida at the time. So we did have a nice chat on the phone. And I asked her for the usual things, you know, like where did he live? Do you have pictures? That kind of thing. And so I did look him up in the high school yearbook in the library. He's in the class of 38. Here's Paul. They called him Dracula because I thought he looked like Dracula. Do you think he looks like Dracula? Well, yeah, maybe kind of. Maybe the way he's holding his head there. And this is the yearbook writer for the Allentown in this decade was really good. It says Dracula is a real friend, for he has the unusual habit of carrying never less than $5 with him. If this capitalist wanted to live the rest of his life without working, all he would have to do would be to charge interest on all his loans. And if he'd collect his loans, he'd make Andy Mellon look like a peanut vendor. But just watch our miracle man sail through college and work himself into some executive position. Well, this is interesting. It sounds as though he's already acting like a businessman. I don't know why. That's kind of interesting. So, okay, his nickname's Dracula and he's sort of a businessman already. So I asked Joanne, you know, sort of the particulars. Where did they live? Well, she said that was a different situation. They lived at 1318 Linden Street, which is this brown and brown house with the big tree on the end there. And when you go around, you see how opulent the porch is. So Linden Street is one of the main streets in Allentown, and it's the one the Banzhoffs would have walked to school on. But right around the corner was Madison Street, and actually the Banzhoffs' backyard and the backyard of this house almost meet at the alleyway in behind them. So yeah, of course Paul would know this, but the whole story here is that Paul and his mother lived with other people. Paul's mother, Florence, was their housekeeper, and so they got to live in the house for free. And the people that they lived with were John and Dorothea Leh, L-E-H as a last name. John Henry Leh and Dorothea Leh. And so Joanne told me this. Now, if my mother and her siblings had been alive, they could have told me this. And maybe in the back of my head, I can hear them talking about Paulie Kemmerer and the Lehs, but I don't know who the Lehs are. Well, the Lehs evidently were movers and shakers in Allentown. They had their own department store, Leh's Department Store. They helped establish the Allentown Bethlehem Easton Airport as it now exists. They both had pilot's licenses at a time when women wouldn't have been encouraged to be pilots. So knowing that there was a connection between Paul and Florence Kemmerer and John Henry and Dorothea Leh, I found this. Now, I did not click on this to get Ancestry. You know, Ancestry can tease you and give you little tidbits. And then if you want the whole record, of course, you click and then they want money. I didn't do that. But here's the census record for 1940. And you can see Paul and Florence. They've got the wrong last name there. It's not Kemmerer, it's Kemmerer. So either the computer got it wrong or the census taker back then got it wrong, but they're living with John Henry and Dorothea Lay. And they sound like it's really interesting. And so since Paul's father was out of the picture and they're living with these business people, John Henry and Dorothea Lay probably were role models to all the kids in school, all the kids in the neighborhood, you know. And no wonder Paul was, you know, being a businessman already. So when I asked Joanne for pictures, she didn't send me a picture of her father. Actually, I found this picture in my mother's album. She sent me a picture of John Henry and Dorothea Lay. Well, they look like terrific people. And they were in charge of all the air raid wardens in the neighborhood. And so they obviously had commandeered my aunt to be one of them. And so that's what they were doing in the war effort, in addition to taking care of the airport and their department store and being good role models to all the kids in the neighborhood. That's really interesting. And again, knowing the connection between the Kemmerers and the Lays, I could find this article that when John Henry Lay died in the 1980s, he left $200,000 to 13 charities, and one of the people that he left money to was Paul Kemmerer of North Brunswick, New Jersey. He left him $20,000, less any outstanding loans, it said. Kemmerer's mother worked for Lay and his first wife for years. And Paul did go into a business, I don't remember what, but he had good role model, and all the kids in the neighborhood had good role models. That's interesting to find out. Again, if my mother were alive, you know, she could tell me 15 seconds who all these people were. I can figure this stuff out. Lawrence McKeever, it was actually addressed to my aunt, and he calls her Bertha, so I know he doesn't know her very well. And Lawrence McKeever is writing from Australia. This 2-page letter. On the first page, he's talking about poinsettias and how the bushes in Australia of poinsettias are so big, they're as big as our lilacs, and they're beautiful. And then he says, at present, I'm being treated for a skin infection. I don't think it's serious, but the treatment is a long, drawn-out process. Other than this, I've not been sick a day. Now, he's a Navy Seabee in the South Pacific, and when I read that to somebody, they said, hey, that could be a clue, because when they were building infrastructure somewhere, one of the islands, all the men who were working on it got a skin infection. And evidently, Mac McKeever was one of them. I guess I could do some more research and figure that out. But then on his second page, he also says, I'm glad you like your new boss. I always liked Henry and I think he will make a good superintendent. Give him my regards. So he knew her from the highway department. That's how he knew her. That makes sense. That's why he called her Bertha. So I only had this one letter, and he was much older than the other soldiers that they wrote to. And he went by Mac as a nickname. So I did find his obituary pretty quickly. It said he was a Navy veteran of World War II. Unfortunately, he and his wife, Helen, had no children. It does say that he worked for the highway department, so I knew I had the right guy. But fortunately, in this very succinct obituary, it also has the names of his parents. So what I did was figure out that he had siblings, even though it doesn't mention them here. He had other siblings, so I made a big family tree, and I kept looking for obituaries. And I figured I would give this letter to a niece or a nephew, somebody who knew Lawrence somewhere along the line. And so this took a little longer than all the others, but I finally landed on Carol Hartung. She is Lawrence McKeever's niece, and he was her favorite uncle. And she was delighted to sit down and talk to me about her uncle. Carol is not the keeper of any of the family stuff, so she didn't have a photo. I could have asked her nephew, and I said, no, that's okay. We don't have to go that far. But so she told me stories. He was really good at carpentry. He was really good at mechanical kinds of things, which is why he was great at the highway department, why he was really good at the Navy Seabee stuff and whatever they were doing down there. She said he built his own home. So yeah, she told me all kinds of good stuff about him. And I was again grateful that I could give her a letter out of the blue from an uncle that she hadn't seen in 40 years, you know. Now, here's an interesting one. This has nothing to do with my family at all, but as I was looking through the high school yearbooks, I was remarking on how all these other people were normal and that nobody was outstanding or, you know, a celebrity. Well, I forgot about a celebrity who attended Allentown High School. He was 2 years younger than my mother, and he probably passed her in the hallway. Who knows? But that's Leto Anthony Iacocca. He had gone to Allentown High School. And eventually, you know, he would become exceedingly well known as an automobile executive for Ford and Chrysler. And even in his high school yearbook, you can see this kind of stuff already bubbling up. It says he is a raconteur extraordinary, and not only can he quip with the best, but he can pun with the worst. If knowledge really is power, he is omnipotent. This, together with the ability he has developed in managing, directing school affairs, will prove a great asset in his career of engineering. And he's the president of the National Honor Society. He's been in the debating society for 3 years. He's the manager of the swim team. He's on the play committee for years and the Latin club for years. He's already doing all this stuff in high school. And eventually, you know, he's going to head, like I said, Ford and Chrysler. He used to be on our TVs a lot too in the 70s. And yet he, at the same time, if you read any of his memoir or biographies, he in high school suffered from rheumatic fever. And that's why he didn't go off to war. He had a medical exemption, I believe. And actually, Lee Iacocca died in the summer of 2019, last year. So there was a more contemporary picture of Lee. But yeah, so he was from the same place as all of these other people. Yeah. And, you know, who knew that he was going to turn out to be this famous person? Going back to my mom for just another second here, like I said, before I go to the last soldier that I researched, my mother wrote letters home. Now, she was in Philadelphia with her brother in the Army with a car, okay? And so they used to go home at least every other Sunday, if not maybe every Sunday, to go to church. And in spite of that, my mother would write 2 or 3 letters home during the week. Of course, they didn't talk on the phone. I think they had a phone, but they didn't talk on the phone. That would have been a long distance call, unnecessary. And she could only have had it. There was a pay phone, I believe, either on the street or in her apartment building. She didn't have a phone. And it would have been a party line anyway, you know, and then other people would have been on. And so I'm kind of grateful that I have all these letters from her, because she was evidently really into telling stories. And here she is. She's 17 years old when she goes off to Philadelphia. She's the youngest in the family. She's leaving her mom, everything that she knows. She's only an hour and a half away from home, but still, it must have seemed like another world. She's with all these other people. She's learning all these things in nurses training. Now, the university didn't have dorms for the nurses. There were more than 150 nurses in her class. That's just in her class, and there were 3 years worth of nurses there. So the university was commandeering apartment houses in Philadelphia. And what they were doing was take over most of them and then kind of push out the residents who were already there, I guess. So one of her first letters home, she says to her mother, You should see our mosquito bites. Either that or bed bugs. We haven't found out yet. We have our mattresses now so we can sleep in peace. I don't know what that was all about. Last night, I almost caught a mouse. It was in apartment 2B, and I'm in 5B. These girls were scared stiff of it, and it was only about an inch long, not including the tail. I took some Kleenex and got it by the tail, but it jumped into a closet. That's their hard luck, not mine. Well, that's my mother. You know, she's a doer, but you know, she has a point. She has a limit. She says, you know, we still have tenants living here, so we're supposed to make all the noise we can. The quicker they get out, the quicker we get settled. The girls screamed when they found the mouse. Some crabby man came out and asked what was the matter. One girl said, it's a mouse. Then the jerk said, you little babies, afraid of a mouse, and he slammed the door. Well, that's that. Well, I guess I'll have to close now. Miss Lynch will be in soon. See you Sunday. Love and kisses, Jeanette. So she talks about living in this apartment house. They obviously have hours. They have study halls. They have a really regimented schedule of what they're supposed to do. But then, like I said, she would come home for the weekend, and sometimes she would bring a friend home. And in one of her first letters, she pleaded with her mother. And she said, Mother, can I please bring Marilyn Seitz home with me? Marilyn is having a hard time. Her brother just got listed as missing in action. Oh, Mother, please, can I not bring her home? And I was kind of surprised at this. First of all of these letters, you know, they're never talking too much about the war, but suddenly the war is very real. Marilyn Seitz's brother was listed as missing in action. And my mother's concerned, obviously, and she wants to bring her home, get her out of the city, into another city, but away. But I was surprised at my mom asking permission of her mother. The mother that I had, the woman that I knew, was a really determined young woman, and she would have just said, you know, hey Mom, I'm bringing this friend home. She has to come home with me. I don't really care what you say. I was kind of surprised she didn't just say that. But yeah, so evidently she took Marilyn home. And then about a month later, she starts a letter to her mother, and she says, Dear Mom, I have some wonderful news for you. Mr. and Mrs. Seitz got a telegram that Albert is a prisoner in Germany. Okay, so he's not missing in action anymore. Now he's a prisoner in Germany. He's a POW. Marilyn was so excited she didn't know what to do. I sure do feel happy for her. She's been writing to him ever since they got the first telegram. Mr. Seitz got 2 very nice letters from the government, one from Washington and the other from his major. His major said that Albert will never be forgotten by his men. He spoke very highly of him. Wow. So it seems kind of odd to think that you're happy because your brother is a POW, but at least he's not missing in action anymore. And it really brings home the thing. I don't really know how these young people coped with all of this stuff, this big, you know, the war, the tragedy of all of it. I mean, you know, sure, it had some romance, you know, stereotypical romance to it, but, you know, it really wasn't. And things happened. And things happened to people you knew. Roy Schmoyer was in D-Day. He survived, but he got injured. You know, probably everybody in Allentown had been writing to Roy Schmoyer. So, yeah, I don't know how they coped with it, you know. And if you tried to talk to them about it, they just said, well, it was something we did. It's something we had to do. Just like, I guess, with what we're coping with now this year, you know, it's something that we've grown to have to do. You know, years later, somebody asks us how we did it, we'll just say, well, we had to do it. I don't know. But anyway, this was a real eye-opener for me. I never saw my mother vulnerable, you know, or that young, obviously. And naive and innocent and whatever. So it's a different side to her. So if you have letters from your parents that you've never read, I would really, really encourage you to do it. I have met some people who say, I have letters between my parents and I'm afraid to read them. I don't know why you'd be afraid to read them. Okay, if your parents are already gone, don't you think they'd want you to know what they did back then? I don't know. Sometimes Jeanette got upset when Bill and Anna didn't write back to her right away. Sometimes she wrote to Teddy the dog. Sometimes she drew pictures of Teddy the dog. Here's Teddy with a collar with 4 stars on it. So maybe Ike has 3, or maybe Ike has 5 because there's 2 more stars up above. I don't know. But it says a 4-star general waiting for his 2 non-commissioned brothers to come home by MJB. Jeanette was her middle name. Also for his little sister who doesn't have a star. Oh, how lovely. It doesn't look like Teddy at all, but okay. So here's the woman that I knew. This is the mother that I knew. She was a very forceful, effervescent, extroverted mother. And so here she is as the president of the Women's Club for a couple of years on the left. She was in the newspaper for advertising the arts and crafts fair that they were going to have. She's doing embroidery in that picture. And as a nurse, well, she was a stay-at-home mom for me until I was in junior high. And then she went out to family clinics in our area. She worked as a nurse in the family clinics. And then when I was in 9th grade, which would have been 1971, maybe 72, somewhere in there, Johns Hopkins University in Baltimore announced a brand new program, absolutely brand new certification program for nurses to become what they called nurse practitioners, to get a little bit more responsibility, do things only doctors had done before, but that were routine enough that they could do them. Well, Mom was intrigued. She really wanted to do this. So we only lived about an hour and a half away from Baltimore. So either that semester or that whole year, she spent her weekdays down in Baltimore at Johns Hopkins, and then came back on the weekends to take care of my father and I, because of course we could not take care of ourselves, you know, make dinner, do the laundry, all that kind of stuff, because of course, you know, we couldn't handle it. But that's what she did. So she was one of the first people to become certified as a nurse practitioner. Now we have them all over the place, and you probably see them more than you see your doctor. She'd love that. She'd love how that has evolved over the past couple of decades. And that's what she did until she died in 1993, complications of cancer. She smoked up until the day she died. So, you know, and she always said, well, you have to die of something. Well, oh well. And she was a nurse and should have known better. But yeah, so that's who I knew. But now let me tell you my last story, and that's about Louis Krieg. Ironically, Krieg in German means war. And I could tell, first of all, I had 19 letters from Louis Krieg. I could tell that I really wanted to meet his children. I figured out that Louis and my mother were friends. I mean, there wasn't anything more than that. They were friends. They were high school classmates even. And I could piece this together from his letters. The first letter was actually a postcard. It's down there in the bottom left. And it says, "Hi, Jeanette. First of all, give my regards to Mr. Bachman. I didn't get to see him before I left. I am in the medical department in a medical training battalion. Our training starts on Monday and lasts for 17 weeks. How about some news of AHS when you write?" Allentown High School. And that was in March of 44. In April, Easter Sunday, he writes to her again, wonders what's happening in Allentown, just wants news from home. And then at the end of April, he writes, "Only 24 more days of school. I wish I was still there. It's not that I don't like the Army. I like it a whole lot, and I'm very glad I'm in it, but I like civilian life better." Wow. Here he is, this young guy, he's dealing with all this stuff. I don't know how he did it. So I figured out from his letters, they were in the same class of 1944. And sometime in March, 49 senior boys from the class of 44 at Allentown High left school to join the war effort, to go off to basic training. And Allentown High School said, "You can go with our blessing. Go do what you have to do. You are members of the class of 44. We forfeit the rest of the school year for you. You can come back for graduation if you're able. If not, we will send you your diploma. You have our blessing. Go do what you have to do." And Louis was one of them. And so he went off to basic training in Texas. And then he was in a medical battalion and he wanted to become trained as an X-ray technician. So he got sent to Fitzsimmons General Hospital in Denver, Colorado to learn how to become an X-ray technician. And then he went back to Texas, to the place he was before, I forget the name. And then eventually in 1945, he got over to France. Now, I don't know if they had to set up, a field hospital. I'm not exactly sure. But I know that he was in Reims, France, because he sent my mother pictures. One of their letters had these pictures in it, black and white photos. Now, this is not the Notre Dame in Paris. This is Notre Dame Cathedral at Reims, okay? At Reims. And so, yeah, I thought, wow, I really hope I can find his family because we would have the most in common. I mean, he was the same age as my mother. They obviously were friends. They were both in the medical field. So they're the ones I wanted to find. So I already had his entry in the yearbook because he's in my mom's yearbook. And it says, Louis is a swell friend and an all-round good fellow. Everybody's well. Isn't that great? We envy him his sparkling blue eyes and his mop of wavy blonde hair. Because of his many likable qualities, Louis has numberless friends and is a welcome addition to any gathering. He has all the qualities that make for success. Doesn't he look like a great guy? And I thought, I want to meet his family. I really want to meet his family. We would have the most in common. It's like a great guy. So I tried my technique of looking online, Louis Krieg, Allentown, and I did not find an obituary for Louis Krieg. I found his wife's, and that she died in 1997. And it says that she was a member of Christ Lutheran Church. So not only was Louis in the same class with my mother, but they also went to the same church. So did Paul Kemmerer. So, all these connections. Again, they were live. They could tell me this, but no. So in his wife's obituary, it says she was the wife of the late Louis E. Krieg Jr. So this was 1997. So he was already gone. Okay. Good information to have. Sometimes you have to divorce yourself from the emotions of this situation when you're doing research, genealogical research. I mean, obviously, emotions are involved and family is involved. Says there are 3 surviving children, James of Allentown, daughter Susan of York, and a daughter Sally of Florida. I found Louis's mother's obituary from 1987. She was a member of Christ Lutheran Church. Everybody goes to the same church. But then under survivors, it says a son, Louis Jr., died in 1974. Now I felt bad. This is something bad. That he died in 1974. He would have been in his 40s. This is something bad. And I wanted even more to find the family. So going back to the wife's obituary, June's obituary. So I wrote to Susan. She lived in York, which is not far from Lancaster. Wrote her a letter. Now, when I sent these letters and when I sent that first email to Marty, I also attached copies of the first couple of letters, just so again, they knew I was not making it up and that I was not, looking for a handout for something, whatever. So I did send a couple of the first letters along to Sue, and I didn't hear, and I didn't hear, and I didn't hear. And these are the people I wanted to find the most. And I was kind of frustrated and upset. And I was getting ready to move back to Massachusetts, and I thought, I got to find them before I go, before I leave Pennsylvania. So then I wrote to James, who lived in Allentown. I can find, you can find they don't have their addresses there, but you can go online, you can find it. You really can't hide too much anymore, which is kind of the exciting thing. And I could never have done this research in this quick amount of time if we didn't have the internet and electronic searching. So there are advantages to it. But I didn't hear from James either, Jim. So eventually Sue wrote to me, or she emailed me, and she said, I'm sorry there's been such a delay. I was on vacation. And of course, she was shocked that I had 19 letters from her father from the war. Shocked. But she said, you know, he's been gone so long, I don't even know if I would recognize his handwriting. Wow. No, I felt bad. And so I asked her, the general questions. Like I said, where did they live? And she told me 1018 North 19th Street was where he had grown up, which was a different part of town with single family and double family homes that were not row homes. But the Kriegs and the Banzhoffs had gone to the same church. And like I said, Louis and Jeanette were high school classmates. And so I made arrangements to meet Sue and Jim. And so there they are. We had a great time, had a wonderful lunch. So those are their sister who lived in Florida is no longer living. And so it's just Sue and Jim. And as soon as I saw Jim, I had been looking at his father's yearbook picture for so long. I said, oh my gosh, you look like your father. And he said, yeah, I used to get that when a lot of people knew my father. So Jim said, we had a great time connecting. I mean, all of us had been baptized at Christ Lutheran Church in Allentown. Jim still goes there. A lot of the older people in the congregation still knew his family and all that kind of stuff. And during lunch, Jim said, look, I know you want pictures. I've got a box for you out in the car. And I thought, wow, a box. I hope it doesn't look like the box that I started out with, which was falling apart. But no, it didn't look like that. It looked like this. This is a plastic bin in my book. It's not a box. But Jim said, I don't know what's in there. I know it's my father's military stuff. I've never looked. I have no idea what's in there. But you can borrow it as long as you want. Make copies of whatever you want. We know you want to do something with this maybe. So yeah. Whenever you're done, just let us know. Wow. He said, you can see there's dust on the top because I haven't ever looked at it. Wow. So, wow. Okay. So I was getting ready to move from Pennsylvania back here to Massachusetts, and I kept putting it off. I put their name on this box so I wouldn't forget it. So I wouldn't want to move with it. And so one night I thought, okay, I got to look in here. I don't know what's in here, but I got to do it. And wow, all I could say over and over and over was, wow, I wished it had been mine. Evidently, Louis Krieg saved everything, starting with the documentation that he passed his first physical for the Army. He saved everything. His mother must have saved everything. His wife must have saved everything because somebody put it in this plastic bin. And just wow, I wished it had been mine. Louis had still in there the basic field manual that they gave to soldiers. He had the handbook from the Fitzsimmons Hospital where he learned how to be an X-ray technician. He had the first aid manual out in the field for World War II. He had, I don't know, 8 to 10 photo albums, sort of had a corduroy cover on them. They had U.S. Army written on them with the Army insignia on them, as if they were encouraging the guys to take photographs. And so when you opened them up, they had little slots on either side that you could stick the photos in. You can even see on this one on the right, you can see the Eiffel Tower peeking out from underneath from when Louis was in France. And would you believe it? Are you sitting down? When you turned every one of these pictures over, Louis had written who was in the picture and where he took it. Oh my gosh, what a treasure trove. I wish it had been mine. And all the negatives of all of the photos were also in the box. And the photos documented his entire journey from leaving the train in Allentown, all the boys from the high school going off to war, wherever they were going to go, all of him in his uniform, different places, different times. He and his colleagues learning how to use the X-ray equipment, such as it was. And then one of them, albums, I opened this one, and this picture was at the very, very top, and it looks European. And obviously it's an official coming down, a couple officials coming down the steps. And on the back, Louis had written, General Eisenhower at Reims. Note the 5 stars on the license plate. Whoa! How is he getting that close to General Eisenhower, first of all? And second of all, 5 stars? Gee, that means that Teddy the dog back in Allentown has 6 on his little hat. Anyway, who gets this close to General Eisenhower? This is insane. And then somebody mentioned to me, oh, well, that's Kay Summersby walking behind General Eisenhower. She was his secretary, wink, wink, nod, nod. Now, I had not known any of this kind of story. I'm not a historian of World War II. I just don't know all this stuff. So I actually just got out of the library. I just borrowed her memoir from 1948 called Eisenhower Was My Boss. It's fascinating stuff. And yeah, there was some talk later on in her life that maybe they were more than that, but I don't think so. And she certainly doesn't say it in the memoir from 1948. But they, their headquarters was in Reims at one point, close to the end of the war. And so that's when Louis saw them. And I also, in that book, found out that Eisenhower was a fan of little Scottish dogs, little Scottish Terrier dogs. And they had one named Telek that went with them wherever they were and wherever their headquarters was. So there's Telek on the steps too, that I never would have understood without reading this book. And one of their other associates tried to goad Teddy into the back seat of the car. Wow. This is a unique picture that nobody else has. Somebody might want this, somebody might want this. So he documented all of his time, including he and his buddies coming back home on the ship late in 1945. The ship had a newsletter. Louis kept all the copies. Fitzsimmons Hospital put on plays. Louis kept all the programs from the plays. There was unique stuff in this box that nobody had ever looked in. I really wished it was mine, but it was Louis and his family's. So, well, I made copies of what I wanted to make copies of, and I emailed Sue and I said, okay, I'm ready to give you the box back. We need to talk. We need to talk. So she came over and I just started doing what I just did to you and kept pulling things out of the box one by one. And her eyes kept getting bigger and bigger and bigger. And she said, well, we never knew. We had no idea. But now, what do they do with it all? See, the thing is, that's a hard thing. That's a hard thing to decide. Not every library, and even though Becky is sitting right now in the local history room of the Storrs Library, not every library, not every historical society can take this stuff and do the best job with it. And the last thing you would want to do is give this box to somebody and to just have it sit in another corner for decades. You don't want to do that. So Sue said, I'm going to have to figure out what to do with this now. It would be nice if we could make it available to other people, scan both sides of the pictures, because the captions are worthwhile too, and all the stuff. And I think they're still deciding that. But it took a couple of days later, after I gave her the box back and after we went through it all, that Sue wrote to me on email and she said, thanking me again for prodding her brother and her to look at this box, because she said, if you had not asked, we probably never would have known. Neither Sue nor Jim have children. So, probably whenever their mother died, Jim was still living in the same area. Everything got moved to his house, but he didn't look in it. So when they go, who's going to do, who's going to look in the attics and who's going to look in the basements and who's going to know what it is and who's going to take care of it? It's really a tough decision to make. And they're still deciding, although they invited their nephew and niece up from Florida one year and they all went through all the pictures. So the next generation knows, and the next generation is as committed to saving Louis' stuff and preserving it and getting it in the right hands of people as Sue and Jim are. So that's kind of cool. In the meantime, the Allentown Morning Call digitized more papers from the 1970s. And so here is that I found online, Louis Krieg's actual obituary from 1974. He was 48, I think. Yeah, 48. And he had worked for PP&L, the electric company, and he had served both in World War II and in Korea. And during our lunch, Jim and Sue told me that what he had died from at such a young age was prostate cancer. Now, 1974 is not the Middle Ages. It's not medieval times, but 1974 prostate cancer wasn't as dealt with as it is now, as it is on more in the forefront of what people test for or expect or know what to do about, And lurking in their minds all along, at least in their mother's mind all along, was their father susceptible to cancer from using X-ray equipment during World War II without a lot of protection? It doesn't look like the setup that we have now, for sure, for the X-ray equipment. If that's protection, if that board is protection, I don't know. Now you go to the dentist and get your teeth X-rayed, you're encased in lead all over, then not so much. So it would be an interesting research topic actually to go back and see the names of his friends who learned X-ray equipment technician job with him. Did they all die young? I don't know. So many things, so many questions, so many. Who would know? Who would suspect that a box full of letters would come up with so many stories? Okay, so my first recommendation to you all is look in boxes, please. I did. And look what I found. There's so many things. There's so many connections. There's so many stories. If you still have people that you can ask questions of, please do write down your stories. I really need to write out the story of Teddy and the dog, Teddy and the hat with the stars on it. People have suggested it would make a good children's book. We'll see. But open boxes, look for things, read letters. If you're worried about reading letters that other people wrote because you're worried about what you're going to find out, maybe hand them off to a friend or a relative that you can trust and say, you read them first. If I have to worry about anything, let me know. But be prepared to be surprised too. There's a lot of interesting things out there. So yes, so this is not a Massachusetts story or a Longmeadow story. It's a story from another place, and it's certainly another place and time. But what it comes down to is people now, people then, how much we're alike, how much we want to share, how much we want to learn from each other. And thank you very much for listening to my story. Thank you to Becky. Thank you to Lindsay, both to the library and to the Senior Center and to the Longmeadow Cultural Council for bringing us this program. And now I'm going to turn it back over to Becky. And if you guys have questions, let me know. Oh, and there, of course, there is one question in chat right away. Have you considered writing a book about this? I have considered writing a book about this, but you know what? It's not really my story. It's all these other people's stories. So if I could get them to write the chapters, that would really be cool. That would really be cool. I have found some of the New Jersey people. I've never met them. I did find the cousins out in Western Pennsylvania. I've never met them. So there's some other people that I still have to meet in this quest whenever that's possible. But yeah, a book has come to mind, but again, it's not really my story. In a way, it's not really my story. Becky.
Yes. Thank you so much. This was wonderful. Got thumbs up. I've already gotten comments and emails. What a great presentation, how interesting this was. And people have really enjoyed it. I've definitely enjoyed it. I haven't done my family history, but it has resonated with me with some of the things I've gone through with my own family recently. Like you said, it's a story about people. So even if it's not Longmeadow, I think a lot of people can find some kind of connection to that story and remind us of our families and what to look for and what, and to ask questions.
Absolutely.
Really appreciate this presentation. I have given everybody the ability to unmute themselves, so please feel free to ask questions, to jump in. You can also use the chat box. Again, this is being recorded, so you will be recorded if you decide to turn on your microphone to speak with us. But we're happy to help through chat as well.
Before you do that, Becky, well, as you are doing that, somebody says maybe the Smithsonian would be interested. Yeah, I'm not so sure about that. Now, there is a World War II museum the big one is in New Orleans. There used to be one in Natick, Massachusetts, and they would take things, but eventually they got filled and they had to close because they have to find another place that's bigger. But Becky, maybe you can talk about the kinds of things that your library takes from people.
So we have not been actively building the collection recently. I started in my position about 1.5 years ago. So I was here for less than a year before COVID started. With COVID, I'm not sure that we don't have a policy in place at the moment. We're not taking general donations, but those are usually more book sale materials. If somebody does have materials, I would certainly be happy to discuss it with them. We do have, as I said, I'm in the local history and genealogy room here. It's a lot of published genealogies. There are a lot of bound volumes here of family genealogies from the history of the area. We don't really have a lot of donations, contemporary donations from people who are building their own personal family histories now. And this would be something probably to talk with the Historical Society about. Corinne, our Longmeadow Historical Society is actually right next door to us, and we partner with them on a lot of programs as well. So that would definitely be a venture I would love to explore. So if anybody is interested, definitely feel free to reach out to me. You should have received the email invitation from me. So that is my email. You can reach me at any time with that, and I'd be happy to discuss it. But unfortunately, we do not have an active collection policy for history and genealogy, and the space is a little tricky. But it's definitely something that we're interested in opening up again.
I have met some people who are in similar situation to me and have self-published a book of their family's letters, and then they make enough copies so that they can give some to every member of the extended family. And so that's another possibility, that if you have letters like that and you want to share them with the rest of your family, it's pretty easy now online. There are all kinds of different programs where you can put pictures together, and and self-publishing has come so far in the last 10 years even, that it's possible for anybody to do that, really. And then if it's in a published book form, it's more easily given to places like the library and the Historical Society, rather than loose letters. Loose letters is a cataloging challenge, shall we say.
It's a whole other process that's different from books. It's more of a special collections or an archive, which a book we can put a label on and put it on a shelf. Loose materials, we need boxes. We need what we call a finding aid, probably, that will list everything in each individual box. And that's part of why that's not something we've been working on right now with the limited staff and the space, especially during COVID. But that is a great option. I don't know of a lot of local genealogical societies off the top of my head. New England Historic Genealogical Society is based out of Boston. They're actually not just based in New England. They have a lot of great resources. Actually interned there for a little bit.
Oh, wow.
Well, yeah. It's a great resource, and they are probably a good place to start, just to see what's out there, what kind of resources for other genealogy practices. I would recommend that as one option for a starting place, because they could also probably connect you to other local and possibly smaller venues.
Becky, do you have access to Ancestry.com and Heritage Quest through your
Yes,
library?
we do. I don't know that people can access them from home anymore. Over the summer, it was opened up at home. You might need to come into the library to use it now, but it is free and open on the library. We have 45-minute appointments right now, which not a whole lot of time to do genealogy research, but as you've demonstrated with your presentation, it's an incremental process, kind of chip away at it a bit at a time. So we'd be happy to have you in here and to get you set up on a computer to also use those.
Hi, can you hear me?
I can hear you.
Oh, well, my name's Maggie Humberston. I run the library and archives at the Wood Museum of Springfield History down on the Quadrangle. And we have a full genealogy and local history library here. It was started back in 1905, so we have lots of collections. All of the books that I'm looking at behind you, Becky, we probably have many of them too. But we also have archives, and we do take collections, personal papers, church materials. We have a big photograph collection, et cetera, et cetera. We like to work with people. We actually are open 2 afternoons a week during COVID. Tuesdays and Thursdays from noon to 4. You do need to make an appointment in advance, but it just means an email or a phone call. I don't mean to do a commercial here, but I just want to let you folks who are listening know that there is a place that you can come that is much closer than having to go to Boston. And we'll be happy to help you, and we'd love to have you come and visit.
Excellent. Thank you.
Thank you.
So I believe it's the Springfield History Library and Archives at the Springfield Museums.
Yes.
Okay, I'm going to put that. I just found it online. I'm going to put that in the chat box for anybody who wants to open that while we're still here in Zoom.
Yep.
Always love finding, like I said, a local resource, something closer. The one in Boston, you can definitely email them. You don't have to go up to Boston to start. You probably would long term to do some more in-depth research, but they could at least be an avenue to start. But always love promoting Springfield and especially the Quad. So thank you, Maggie.
Thanks.
Thank you, Maggie.
Thank you, and I loved your presentation. So thanks for making that available to us. It was fun.
Oh, thanks. It's fun to talk about it.
Yeah.
Anybody else? I could also say that we are also honored, shall we say, to be this close geographically to the 5 colleges. Mm-hmm. And so when I was doing historical research, something that Becky didn't mention in the introduction is that, yes, I was a librarian for a long time, but I've also written a couple of books about American author Henry David Thoreau. And when I was doing my own research, I found the academic libraries, UMass Amherst and Amherst College and Smith College, especially those 3. When you can get there and when that is possible and you just follow the rules, great resources there too. So anybody living in Western Mass, wow, we have really good resources. And we've got this magnificent library system called CW Mars, where you can borrow a book from anywhere in Central or Western Mass. Are you kidding me? This is great. From somebody who lived in other states that were not that advanced, should we say. It's just a great place to be able to do research. It really is. It really is. Anybody else got any other questions? I've been talking a long time.
You may also want to check out BPL, Boston Public Library. All Massachusetts residents, but also if you don't live in Massachusetts, but you work in there, or you work in the state, or you do own property in the state, everybody's entitled to a BPL library card, and you can get an e-card. So it's for electronic use only, but that gives you full access to all of their electronic resources. And they have a lot of other study guides, a lot of research guides, including genealogy and history. So that's also something to consider. I'm not sure if it's BPL.
Yeah, that's bpl.org. That's
.org?
absolutely,
Okay.
that's absolutely good.
Sure.
Yeah, that's absolutely good. Yeah, because they have archival newspapers too.
Yes.
Yeah.
So that's another good resource, especially while a lot of things are shut down or restricted. Just the electronic resources. It's a very simple application process, just confirming that you have an affiliation with Massachusetts, basically, and the same general information as the regular library card, your name and contact information.
Right.
Get a library card number to access everything. So I would recommend that as well.
Well, okay.
Yeah.
Yeah. If there's no other questions.
Yeah, I think this was a great presentation. We had some good discussion points. We've been going for almost 2 hours though, so I think.
I know.
So thank you again, Corinne. This was a great program. I really appreciate you taking time out of your afternoon to speak with us and to share your story.
Thank you, Becky and Lindsay and everybody in Longmeadow. Yay. Take care of yourselves and go look in boxes again. Go look in boxes.